It seems to me perfectly reasonable to imagine, and I don't know the answer to this question, but wouldn't it be reasonable to imagine there are some situations in which additional guns make you safer, while at the same time there are some situations that you could easily identify in which guns make you a little less safe? Don't you think that there's a difference between situations? So if somebody says, I'd like to test in this Texas county having more guns, we'll just see what happens. I say, if it can be tested, go ahead. Go ahead and test it. If somebody else wants to test having fewer guns, let's say Chicago, I'd say, let's test it. Let's see if it makes a difference. Now, in order for your test to be successful, you would need to have some sense of comparables, meaning other places that are similar enough in crime profile that if you make a major change in one of those places and there's a difference in the crime level, you might say to yourself, hey, those two places that were just like this up until today, they didn't get any improvement. Now, it might take more than a year, it might take 3-5 years or something, but if we're not continually testing to see what works and what doesn't, and if we're not open to the fact that what works in Chicago may be completely opposite of what works in some place in Texas, if we don't acknowledge that there could be a gigantic difference in what works in different situations, we're not really serious about this. I got a lot of people chattering yesterday with my opinions because I said that I have the only opinion on guns and gun control in the world, and I stand by that. Now, I saw a few people almost get close to having an opinion, but not really. So I'm going to say it again. I have the only opinion on gun control. Nobody else has an opinion. A lot of people think they have opinions, but they don't. They have half opinions. They have half an opinion, meaning that they talk about the right to own guns without talking about what that costs, meaning the cost in terms of deaths. And then there are other people who only talk about the deaths, and they don't talk about what that might cost us in terms of protecting the republic and protecting ourselves, etc. I'm the only person who has given an honest opinion. Now, you could agree with it or disagree with it, but you can't. It'd be hard to argue that anybody else has an opinion. So here's my opinion. I like the Second Amendment, and I would be willing to keep it up to a cost of about 20,000 accidental and, I guess, intentional murders per year. That's my number. If you can't give me a number, you don't have an opinion. You don't have anything. You're just talking about stuff. But if you want a full opinion, you should say, I would like the benefits of the Second Amendment, personal protection, freedom, protecting from tyranny, all those things. I want all of those things up to a cost of 20,000 deaths per year. Now, some people said, but wait a minute, we're already there because you can't count suicides. To which I say, sure I can. It's my opinion. I can count anything I want. I'm just showing my work. Do I think that we should have half as many suicides? Of course I do. I'd also like half as many murders. I'd like all of it to go down. Now, if you're saying to me, but Scott, you can't make suicide go down by controlling guns, I didn't say you could. Did you hear me say that? I didn't say that. Now, there may be other solutions for making suicide go down. It could be mental health treatments, could be something more creative. I don't care how we get there. I'm just saying that if we can, that's my number. 20,000 would be an acceptable number in a country our size for the freedom that it gives us. All right. Here are some of the arguments, or I'm not sure they're arguments, but the points that people gave me to give some context. A number of people said, Buzz Scott, there are 45,000 people dying a year in automobiles. And there are people dying from alcohol, and there are people dying from cigarettes, and there are people dying in swimming pools, and all that. And what about all that? What's your number for those things? To which I say, keep in mind, all of those things have limits. All of those things have restrictions. You can't drive a car any way you want, whenever you want, under every condition. You don't have that freedom. Automobiles are deeply restricted, including you have to wear your seatbelt, because that number of deaths was too high, and society collectively decided to see if they could make it lower. Likewise with cigarettes, likewise with almost everything else. There are great restrictions on all of those things. Guns would be another category. But the main thing is, it really doesn't matter how many people die from other things. That's not a point. If you're talking about gun control, and you say, yes, but X people die doing other things, that has nothing to do with guns. That context is interesting, and it might tell you that there's something else unrelated to firearms that you also want to talk about, but probably there are already restrictions in that other thing, as there are with alcohol and guns and cigarettes and stuff. So it does not matter if there are other things that kill you too. It's interesting, but it has nothing to do with how you make a decision on gun control. Let me give you an analogy, because they're so persuasive. Now, and remember, analogies are good for making a novel point, but analogies are not good for persuading. So I'm just going to make a point. If the Boy Scouts of America, just, the Boy Scouts, I think they're just called Scouts now. If the Scouts, let's say, killed accidentally 10,000 Scouts per year, would you say to yourself, that's not much? It's only 10,000 children per year killed in the scouting profession or in the scouting organization. So that's fine. It's only 10,000 because there are so many other people who die of cancer. You wouldn't say that. You would treat, and by the way, there nothing like that dying from scouting. This is just a crazy example. But if there were, you would say, well, let's look at scouting. There's something wrong with scouting here. We gotta fix this. So it doesn't matter how many people die from unrelated things. You're still going to look at every decision individually. Somebody said controlling guns in any additional way would not reduce suicide because, quote, Japan has the second highest rate of suicides in the world and some of the strictest gun control. Confiscating guns would not curb the rate of suicides. Really? First of all, here's the first problem. You can't compare Japan to the United States on suicide. If I moved to Japan, I'd probably kill myself in a year. Are you kidding me? Have you seen how tragic and horrible it is to live in Japan if you're a young person? You don't have privacy, you're probably not having sex, you're working all hours, you're living at home. I would frickin' blow my brains out if I were in Japan. And if you didn't give me a gun, I'd go find another way. Living in Japan sounds exactly like a place that would have a high rate of suicide. So I'm not surprised by that. I don't think you can compare those two. But here's the thing. Anytime you introduce friction to anything, you reduce the amount of that thing. You can't really find exceptions to that are meaningful. I mean, maybe you could find some weird exception, but it wouldn't be meaningful in terms of a generalization. All friction reduces the number of people who do that thing. So let me walk through the thinking. If you're suicidal, and it's sort of a temporary situation, and you also have a loaded gun in your house, I would think your danger of suicide is much higher than if you had to plan it and think about it and go to the doctor and get some kind of pills that would kill you and do some research and all that. I'd have to think that simply making you think about it and plan it and do it in a maybe way that is less certain would probably reduce some suicides. Take, for example, all the young people who do these mass shootings. Don't they seem like suicides to you? I mean, we talk about all the people they kill, but they seem like fancy suicides. So if you restricted guns from some of those people who might do fancy mass shooting suicides, you might reduce some. Now, people said to me, Scott, why are you so in favor of gun restrictions? To which I say, I've never said that. I have never said I am in favor of gun restrictions. Never. Here's what I do say. I'm in favor of testing a variety of changes, which could include some restrictions, but it might include, and I think it's worth testing, more guns. So there are two sides. There tend to be two sides. Some people say, give more people guns and you'll be safer. And some people say, take away the guns or restrict them in some ways and you'll be safer. And I say, I think it depends. It seems to me perfectly reasonable to imagine, and I don't know the answer to this question, but wouldn't it be reasonable to imagine there are some situations in which additional guns make you safer, while at the same time there are some situations that you could easily identify in which guns make you a little less safe? Don't you think that there's a difference between situations? So if somebody says, I'd like to test in this Texas county having more guns, we'll just see what happens. I say, if it can be tested, go ahead. Go ahead and test it. If somebody else wants to test having fewer guns, let's say Chicago, I'd say, let's test it. Let's see if it makes a difference. Now, in order for your test to be successful, you would need to have some sense of comparables, meaning other places that are similar enough in crime profile that if you make a major change in one of those places and there's a difference in the crime level, you might say to yourself, hey, those two places that were just like this up until today, they didn't get any improvement. Now, it might take more than a year, it might take 3-5 years or something, but if we're not continually testing to see what works and what doesn't, and if we're not open to the fact that what works in Chicago may be completely opposite of what works in some place in Texas, if we don't acknowledge that there could be a gigantic difference in what works in different situations, we're not really serious about this.